GP training. In this video, I'm going to share with you 3 practical tips to navigate the ethical and professional dilemma case. This is a video you don't want to miss. Imagine you've got Sarah, 15 years old, who is requesting contraception. She doesn't want her parents to know. How are you going to navigate this case? How are you going to manage the ethical issue between patient confidentiality and parental right? This case could prove to be challenging, but if you understand the ethical considerations, then you can manage it confidently. Tip number 1 is to support the patient. Establish good rapport with your patient and make sure that you're supporting the patient to tell you more about the reason behind requesting contraception. As a doctor, you are the advocate of the patient. So the patient trusts you, and you need to make sure that you build on that trust and maintain a good doctor-patient relationship. However, it's important that you don't promise something that you can't keep. For example, in this situation, it's very difficult to know how it's going to play out and whether you can keep everything confidential. For example, if there is any disclosure of something where there is risk that the patient is being abused or there is risk of the patient being at home, then you may have to disclose information the patient tells you. So it's a fine line. It's important that you know how to keep the patient comfortable telling you the story at the same time that you don't falsely reassure the patient. A good way of doing that would be to say to the patient, "Thank you very much for telling me about this sensitive issue that you're going through, and I'm here to help you. Everything we discussed today will be kept confidential unless I'm obliged to disclose anything that put you at risk of harm," for example. So then the patient may be able to trust you and understand that it is kept within confidentiality. Unless there is any risk of abuse or harm, then you might have to disclose it. This is really important that you set the frame that you're here to support the patient and you'll do your best to keep everything confidential unless you're obliged to breach confidentiality. Tip number 2 is to establish the nature of sexual relationship that the patient has. Make sure that you're sensitive when you're asking the questions. What you want to explore is presence of factors suggestive of abusive relationship. For example, you might want to inquire about the age gap between the patient and the sexual partner. If there's a big difference in the age gap, or if the other partner is in a position of power, then there is risk of abuse taking place. It's helpful to ask, how did the patient meet the sexual partner? So if the patient has met somebody at school, for example, and if that person is in a position of trust, for example, a teaching assistant, then this is an abusive relationship. Make sure that you're asking various questions to find out the nature of the relationship. Also ask whether the patient has felt that they've been forced to do something, how happy are they in the relationship, or whether there has been any coercion to do something that they don't want to. Also make sure that you consider whether there has been involvement of alcohol or drug. If the patient has already engaged in sexual activity, consider the risk of sexually transmitted disease, the risk of being pregnant. So it's important that you discuss these issues with your patient. Have you found the insights in this video useful so far? If so, you might be interested in SCA Blueprint and mini course. This is a free blueprint that you can get and teaching from myself. Just click the link down in the description below and sign up, and you will get a teaching from me every day for the next 7 days. Find out why the patient doesn't want to tell their parents about the relationship. And if you find out the reason, then you might be able to persuade the patient to tell the parents. However, if the patient doesn't want the parent to know, they have a right to confidentiality. Tip number 3 is to assess Gillick competency of the patient. Gillick competency is often used interchangeably with Fraser guidelines, but they're two separate things. Gillick competency is about the assessment of capacity for the patient to have treatment, and Fraser guidelines apply to contraception and sexual health. There's no set of defined questions to assess Gillick competency. However, things that you need to consider when assessing a child's capacity to consent include the maturity and mental capacity of the child's age, the understanding of the issue and what it involves, including advantages and disadvantages and potential long-term impact. Also, the understanding of the risk, implications, and consequences that may arise from the decision to take contraception. You need to be satisfied that the child is able to understand your advice and how well they can understand that. Also, understanding of any alternative options if available. Lastly, the ability to explain irrational around the reasoning and decision making. In this case scenario, as a child is under 16 and requesting contraception, Fraser guidelines should be considered. So what are the components of Fraser guidelines? The first point is whether the young person cannot be persuaded to inform the parents or carers that they're seeking advice or treatment, or they won't allow the practitioner to inform the parents. The second point is whether the young person understands the advice being given. The third point is whether the young person's physical, mental health, or both are likely to suffer unless they receive the advice or treatment such as contraception. The fourth point is whether it is in the young person's best interest to receive advice or treatment without the parent or carer to know. This is an element of when a patient who is young coming to the doctor, trusting the doctor, and whether they can receive that advice and treatment without parental consent. Last but not least is whether the young person is likely to continue engaging in sexual activity with or without contraception treatment. By applying Fraser guidelines, this will give you a framework as in how you make the decision and come to that decision whether you're going to prescribe or not for this patient. It's important to point out that Fraser guidelines and guilty competence separate from child protection issue. If you find that there is a risk of abuse in the relationship, then you need to consider whether you need to alert child protection services. And that is really important to have a discussion with the patient. Ideally, if you can seek advice from the person who's the lead for child protection in your practice and ask the patient whether they consent for you to discuss the case with that person. However, if the patient declines and you're still concerned about safeguarding risk, then you may be able to breach confidentiality, but it's important that you know on what ground that you're doing so. If you found this video useful, you might want to watch the next video in which I show you how to manage a complaint for SCA. Click here to watch it. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.